I want to focus on this idea of, what do I do with things outside of my control? And I'll tell you why. For a little over 5 years, I worked for Franklin Covey. Stephen Covey talks about stimulus and response, controlling your response. It's a core tenet of 7 Habits. I recently interviewed somebody who is the director of the Viktor Frankl Institute. So in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he talks a lot about it. And I think it's been ingrained in me almost unwittingly that, bad things happen and there's only one way to attack them, which is to recognize you are the master of your domain. Don't give up power. Take ownership for everything and change it if you so choose. And without recognizing, and I'll tell you why this is important, and those listening might be interested in this, I recently, at my job I'm currently at, we work with a vendor who uses an assessment. It's a older assessment that is the best I've ever seen. And one of the things it assesses is this exact thing we're talking about. How much do you believe is within your control and how much do you believe is outside of your control? And the coach that I was working with that I want to do a podcast episode on said, out of all 16 markers, every time you chose it's within your control, which can be seen as good or bad, right? Initially, I was like, yeah, go me. But then, and this is why I like what you said, I realized like how much burden have I been carrying trying to fix or trying to, or blaming myself for, without acknowledging, without even realizing this blind spot I have, that there are some things that are outside of your control. It's okay to recognize that. Just don't dwell on them. So I'm curious what your perspective is on this idea. What do we do? And I know you talked about it a little bit, but what do we do with those things that impact us immensely, might be outside of our control, and we want to control it?
Yeah, I think this is very difficult. I mean, it's related to a kind of ambivalence that I feel that maybe other people feel too about hope. That hope, on the one hand, is something we venerate. We think of, you should always have hope. You should always be hopeful. But often hoping puts you in the situation where you're vulnerable to things going badly. Like, your hopes can be dashed. And sometimes you start to have this thought, well, maybe I should just give up hope. Maybe it would be really liberating to give up hope. And I think that's sort of a misdescription in an important way, but there's something to it. So again, going back to the case of chronic pain, I think there's a moment that I used to think of as giving up hope, as a kind of liberating giving up of hope, of saying it's not under my control, which is the moment of, at some point, recognizing that going from treatment to treatment, none of which worked, getting my hopes up and then dashed again and again, it was not a good plan. It wasn't working. I should just accept that this condition was not going to change and think, okay, I'm going to live with it. And I thought of myself then as giving up hope and saying, I accept that this is out of my control. But actually, in retrospect, I think that's not the right way to think about what I was doing. And it involves a kind of binary black and white thinking where you say, well, do I hope or do I despair? And almost always the right question is not hope or despair. Can I control it or not? It's what should I hope for? What can I control? Like, look for what you can control. And so you don't have to deny that there are things out of your control. Sometimes they are. But what you can then do is say, well, okay, what can I control? And so I think what happened with me wasn't really that I gave up hope. It was that I gave up hope for a certain kind of magic cure and then asked, well, what could I hope for? I could hope to find a way to have a perfectly good life with this just background annoying condition. That's something I could hope for. And that shift was a shift towards being realistic about what I could control and focusing my attention on that. I mean, I think you get the same phenomenon kind of writ large in the case of something that like freaks me out a lot, probably freaks some listeners out, which is climate change, where you find yourself oscillating between kind of, you read an optimistic news story and you're like, oh my God, there's hope. And then you read some terrible kind of Antarctic ice sheet melting and you're like, despair. And I think the problem there is we're asking the wrong question. if we think, should we be hopeful or despairing? It's not a question of hope or despair. It's a question of what we should hope for. And we should hope for, right now we should be hoping for international coordination on agreements that will kind of reduce fossil fuel use and so on. But if things go badly, what should happen is not give up hope. It's, okay, well, that didn't work. What's the next thing we can hope for? What still remains possible? And I think once you shift from the black and white hope versus despair thinking to asking what can you hope for, you're sort of orienting yourself towards this question of what's under your control, what's still possible, in a way that points you towards agency without the kind of illusion that everything is under your control or the ideal is always possible.
Is there a philosopher that you found aligned with that perspective more? Is there anybody that has informed this thinking the most in you?
That's a good question. I mean, the philosopher, this isn't specifically about hope, but the philosopher whose work I've found most energizing as I've been thinking through this is Iris Murdoch, who's also a novelist. So people may have read her novels. She's a very good novelist. She was a philosopher. She's an interesting career. She was a philosopher in the early part of her career, and then sort of quit to be a novelist, and then carried on doing philosophy on the side. And so she is one of these people who has many careers, but she's someone for whom the central idea in her moral philosophy, her ethical philosophy, is about attention. The idea that attending to reality, attention to other people, is the kind of fundamental prerequisite for dealing with reality well, is just acknowledging it. And often, if you really try to acknowledge what's going on, really describe what's happening, that's half the battle. Once you've really described whether someone was in fact being jealous or just anxious, or you've really figured out what was happening with them, the question of how to feel about it and what to do about it is already, you're most of the way to answering it. And that idea, that kind of key insight, that kind of abundant, attentive reflection on our reality is ethically orienting, that gives us a kind of direction. That's, I suppose, the key idea that moves me. And so, yeah, Iris Murdoch is really the philosopher I most have drawn on recently.
Okay. Yeah, I'm curious because like I said, I don't know a ton about it.